Let's look at number 21. Which of the following principles, if true, is going to justify the reasoning? So let's look for a missing assumption in this argument that's going to help prove the conclusion. So the argument says commitment to relationships or careers is commonly assumed to be virtuous, but all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. After all, okay, so it sounds like that's the conclusion so far because it's followed by the words after all. Usually when you have the words after all, you're about to introduce something that's supporting what you just said in the previous sentence. So this person's trying to prove that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. Why? Because, after all, what one is committed to might be either bad or good. For example, commitment to a relationship that benefits none of the people involved doesn't deserve any praise. Now, right away, you should ideally notice that there's a little bit of a mismatch between the conclusion and the supporting evidence. The conclusion is about all commitments. All commitments should always 100% of the time be seen as morally neutral. Why? Because after all, there are some bad commitments, right? Everything we said in that next sentence was negative information about some commitments. It says what one is committed to might be either good or bad. And then it says, for example, commitment to a relationship that doesn't benefit any of the people involved doesn't deserve any praise. Again, that's something that is true of a certain type of commitment. So some commitments, according to this sentence, some commitments have issues with them. They might be bad. They don't deserve any praise. But it doesn't say all commitments are bad or all commitments deserve no praise. It just says that it can be true some of the time. And then it continues in the next sentence. Often commitment is nothing more than involvement that has outlasted its original justification. Again, often. So this is something that is often true, but not necessarily always true. So what we're given in this latter part of the paragraph, the supporting information, what we're given there is stuff that's bad about some commitments. Commitments might be bad. They sometimes deserve no praise. They sometimes outlast their original justification, but that's not necessarily true all the time, right? And we use that as justification for a conclusion that says, therefore, all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. So that's going to be the jump here. We need to assume, in any argument, we always need to assume if support, then conclusion, right? The support here given is that some commitments are bad. We're given a bunch of assorted information. They can be bad, deserving of no praise, and outlasting their original justification, right? Those are things that are true of some commitments, and we're assuming that if that's true, then therefore all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. So that's what we're looking for. If support, then conclusion. If some commitments are bad in these ways that are enumerated in this paragraph, we're assuming that if that's true of some commitments, then all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. Let's look for that assumption in the answer choices. Remember, anything that doesn't get us to all commitments is not going to be the answer. We need an assumption that's going to get us to our conclusion, which is about all commitments. So if we had an answer choice that said, if a commitment is bad or outlasts its original justification or deserves no praise, then that commitment should be seen as morally neutral. That's not going to be the right answer to the question, because that's just going to prove that those commitments that are bad in those ways should be seen as morally neutral, but that's not enough. We need to prove that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral, right? This is a sufficient assumption question. The question is worded, which of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the reasoning? We need to fully justify that conclusion, which is that all commitments, not just some or most or many, but all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's look for that in the answer choices. A tells us that any commitment that is morally neutral either has outlasted its original justification or doesn't deserve any praise, or both. So is that going to help us prove our conclusion? Our conclusion that we're trying to prove is that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. Why? Because some commitments have outlasted their original justification, don't deserve any praise. Therefore, all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. So A seems to be going in the wrong direction. A says any commitment that that is morally neutral, it must be true that it's outlasted its original justification or deserves no praise, right? So the starting point of A is that you have a commitment that is morally neutral, and A says, now, since you know that it's morally neutral, you know that therefore it's either outlasted its original justification or deserves no praise. This argument is going in the other direction. This argument says that some commitments have outlasted their original justification and deserve no praise, and therefore we're trying to prove that all commitments are morally neutral, right? So A is going backwards, first of all. Second of all, it's not giving us something that's true of all commitments. Our conclusion has to be something that is proven about all commitments. All commitments should be seen as morally neutral. A just says any commitment that is X is Y. But that's not going to help us prove that all commitments are anything, whether it's morally neutral or whatever it is we're trying to prove. We can't prove anything about all commitments based off of A, and therefore A is not the answer for those two reasons. B tells us that commitment to a relationship or career is virtuous if, but only if, that relationship or career is good. So is that going to help us get to our conclusion? What's our conclusion that we're trying to prove? All commitments should be seen as morally neutral. B is not telling us something about all commitments. B is just telling us that commitment to a relationship or career is going to be virtuous if and only if that relationship or career is good. So according to B, if the relationship or career is not good, then that commitment is not virtuous. But that doesn't prove that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral, right? B doesn't even prove that this commitment should be seen as morally neutral. It just says it's not virtuous, right? That doesn't mean that it's morally neutral, first of all. And second of all, it certainly, like we said a minute ago, doesn't extend to all commitments. Therefore, B is really far from our conclusion. We're trying to prove that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. All B does is prove that certain commitments should be seen as either virtuous or not virtuous. But just because they're not virtuous doesn't mean they're morally neutral. And just because they're morally neutral doesn't mean all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. C tells us if a commitment deserves no praise, then that one commitment is morally neutral. Does that help us prove our conclusion? Our conclusion is that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. C just tells us that if a specific commitment is not praiseworthy, then that commitment should be seen as morally neutral. So if we knew that all commitments deserve no praise, then C would therefore prove that all commitments are morally neutral, right? Because if we know that all commitments deserve no praise, and C says any commitment that deserves no praise should be seen as morally neutral, well, that would prove that all commitments are morally neutral. The problem is we don't know that all commitments deserve no praise. We just know, according to the paragraph, that some commitments deserve no praise, right? The paragraph gave us some examples, right? It says commitment to a relationship that benefits none of the people involved, for example, deserves no praise. All we know from this paragraph is that some commitments deserve no praise. And if C is true, that proves that those some commitments are morally neutral. The problem is that doesn't prove our conclusion. Our conclusion that we need to get to here is that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. As we pointed out in the paragraph, that was the biggest jump between the support and the conclusion. The support was giving us negative information about some commitments. The conclusion was jumping to all commitments. So we need to find an answer that says if some commitments are bad in these ways mentioned, then therefore all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. Remember, these words, all, some, really matter a lot on the LSAT, especially when there's a mismatch between them, between the support and the conclusion. The support is about some or often, for example, and then the conclusion is about all commitments. So therefore, C is not going to bridge that gap and is not going to help us prove our conclusion. D says that if a commitment has outlasted its original justification, then that commitment cannot be virtuous. Is that going to help us prove our conclusion that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral? The answer is no, because D is just about that commitment. D just says if a commitment has outlasted its original justification, then it cannot be virtuous. Now, according to the paragraph, we do know that there are some commitments that outlast their original justification, right? It says often commitment is nothing more than involvement that outlasted its original justification. So D tells us that those commitments that are often happening, those commitments must not be virtuous, right? Because D says any commitment that outlasts its original justification cannot be virtuous. And according to the paragraph, we do know that that happens sometimes. Often commitments outlast their original justification. According to D, those commitments cannot be virtuous. But first of all, just because they're not virtuous doesn't mean they're morally neutral. They could be morally negative, right? If they're not virtuous, that doesn't mean they're morally neutral. But second of all, even if they were morally neutral, like we said a second ago, that doesn't mean that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral, right? And therefore, D does not help us prove our conclusion. E tells us that all commitments are morally neutral if... Okay, so far this is pretty good because that's the conclusion. The conclusion is that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. E seems to be helping us get there because it says all commitments are morally neutral if blank. Now, if the blank part, if the next part of the sentence is something that we know to be true from this paragraph, and E says that if that's true, then we would know that all commitments are morally neutral, then this would be the right answer. So what does it say? It says all commitments are morally neutral if there are any commitments that are undeserving of praise. According to the supporting information in this paragraph, do we know that there are any commitments, at least one commitment in the universe that is undeserving of praise? The answer is no. It says, that, for example, commitment to a relationship that benefits none of the people involved deserves no praise. That was part of the supporting information, is that there are some commitments that don't deserve any praise. And E tells us that if that's the case, if there are any commitments that are undeserving of praise, which we know that there are, then E says that then we would know that all commitments are morally neutral. So therefore, E proves the conclusion, which is that all commitments should be seen as morally neutral, right? If all commitments are morally neutral, well, then therefore all commitments should be seen as morally neutral. That's kind of synonymous in this case. And therefore, E is going to be the right answer. It's going to prove our conclusion 100%, and it's going to bridge that gap between some commitments, right, and all commitments. Therefore, E is correct. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.